request out of humility or humbleness. I know the list is much longer, so I expect that is the case. We would love to have Brother Khalid. Inshallah, he will speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session for other 15 minutes.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, I know it's at the end of the day, but you still have to let me know that you're listening at the beginning. You can go to sleep at the end. Assalamu alaikum. I want to thank the National Coalition for Protection of Civil Freedoms and the organizers of this conference for allowing me to come to just share a few ideas with you. I say this in all sincerity. I am very humbled to be in your presence. I'm very honored to be in your presence because you represent a constant reminder to all of us as to what we should be doing as Muslims on a day-to-day basis. You know better than I that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has made it very clear in a very emphatic statement that we are to free the captives. And we find a figure like Imam Malik, radiallahu anhu, who actually said that this saying of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is so important that it means that if you have to take everything in your possession to free a captive, to free a prisoner, then this is what you should do. So I want to just frame the brief comments that I have a little bit in a historical context. And that historical context takes us back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in the early days of the Islamic movement in Mecca. And you know better than I that during those early days of Islam in Mecca that there was a tremendous persecution of those who stepped forward, who had a conscience, those who said that what we are doing in this Meccan society is not pleasing to our Lord. It makes no sense, so we're going to reject it. And we know when we look at that history that so many of them, including the first martyr of Islam, Sumayya, that so many were grabbed up and they were imprisoned by family members. Some of them were tortured, like Sumayya, her husband, Yasser, were even tortured to death. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in these early days in Mecca was not in a position to do much but to make dua. But every time that he knew that some Muslim had been captured or some Muslim had been tortured, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in the seerah literature, we find that he came forward and he was there, encouraging those who were being tortured even to death. And he thought that Allah has promised not only your relative, your loved one who's being tortured, maybe even to death, but the reward that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised to those of you who are patient and expect a reward from Allah because of the affliction, because of the harm, the hurt that you are feeling. And so the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, we would find him standing right beside or in the general area of those people who were being tortured, those people who had been in prison. And he was imploring them, just be patient. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees all. That if your loved one even dies, you know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised Jannah. And if you are patient, then you will be one who will be presented Jannah as well. Brothers and sisters, these Sahaba were prisoners of conscience. They were political prisoners of their time. And we can look at this page from our history and see how it is, no matter what work we do, no matter how much we come together to support one another, that sabra, that patience, is essential. And ihtisab, expecting this reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His forgiveness, is a result of this patience. I want to just sort of quickly go through just a few points. And one is that in that time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and even today, there's a kind of arrogance of power that some people, when they're given the controls of society, when they have the ability to enforce their will on others, that these people get so drunk with their own power that they commit any kind of offense against human beings. That there's no form of deprivation, no form of torture, no form of neglect of the families of those, like in the situation in which we live today, like those Sahaba in Mecca who had done nothing against the state, but were entrapped and were caught up and were tortured simply because of their beliefs, simply because of their conscience. But today we find that in this prison industrial complex, in the environment in which we live today, that there's this attitude that if I can just grab you and take you, I can do whatever it is that I want to do. And so you and I need to, and you know it better than I, but we just need to remind ourselves as to who is actually in control. What has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what has the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, what have they said about this thing called dhulm, this oppression, this taking advantage of other human beings? What relationship does that have in our time today? The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I'll just go sort of quickly through a few of these narrations, that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has made it very clear in a hadith, and I'll just recite just a portion of the hadith that we find in Sahih Bukhari, that when the day of judgment rises, an announcement will proclaim, where are the tyrants and where are their helpers? Even those who fill an ink pot for the unjust ruler, or sold his purse, or sharpened a pencil for the oppressor. So gather them along with the tyrants. Let me give you just a brief story from another page of Islamic history, and this is at a time of Imam Ahmed ibn Hanbal. And you're familiar with Ahmed ibn Hanbal. He was a prisoner of conscience. He was snatched up by a corrupt caliph of his time. And he was put in prison, and he was tortured almost to death in prison for one reason and one reason only, because the people, the Muslims at that time, had come up with this false idea that the Quran was something that was created, and Imam Ahmed said that no, this is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't make this thing up. Don't teach generations of children that the Quran is a created thing. So he was put in prison and he was tortured. And there are many stories about the torture that he endured in prison. But one story just always jumps out to me, and it's about this guard that came to Imam Ahmed, and he said to, "Oh Ahmed, is it true? This hadith that I've heard that you've recited from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, talking about the oppressor and the person who's aiding the oppressor, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will deal with this person," just paraphrasing. And so Imam Ahmed told this prison guard, he said, "Yes, that's right." So the guard says to him, "So I'm considered then to be an aid of the oppressor. That based on this hadith, my understanding tells me that I am aiding the oppressor by keeping you in jail, being your jailer." Imam Ahmed told him, he said, "No, that's not right. The aids of the oppressors that comb your hair, that wash your clothes, prepare your meals, and buy and sell from you. They are the aids. But as for you, you are one of the oppressors. And so it gives us a lesson that you don't have to be the person who's sitting on the bench and condemning someone to outrageous sentences with fabricated cases. You don't have to be the one who arrests or locks the key at night to jail cells. You don't have to be the one who's torturing in these maximum security facilities, these underground facilities, these communication management units. All of these outrageous cages that have been created for human beings, particularly those persons who are designated as prisoners of conscience, that we will call prisoners of conscience, but we know that they're there because of their Islam. And so you don't have to be the one doing that. If you are just in any kind of way assisting, then you are the oppressor that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are making reference to. So it expands out the net. It makes more people culpable. They're more responsible than just a few people. Let me just share just one other narration, and I'll be coming to an end quickly here. And that is that as the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had made it clear about securing the release of the captives, that it is, and as I said at the very beginning, that all of you serve as reminders to those of us who have not been captured and imprisoned falsely, or even family members and loved ones and friends of those who are in this situation. That you serve as reminders of our duty, our responsibility to help awaken this ummah, so that when you have your 5th conference, it's not just the number of people that you have here, which is wonderful, alhamdulillah, to have 4 conferences and to keep a network going, a support network, an education network. I was at the ISNA conference last year, and I bumped into Sister Charmaine and her exhibit. And I found the exhibit fascinating. And I wondered, and I didn't mention it to Charmaine, but I wondered, it was wonderful to have this exhibit at the ISNA convention, but it should have had a higher profile. There should have been more prominence to it because of how critical this issue is for this ummah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Let me just share a couple other things and I'll be done. There's a hadith Qudsi where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ related that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said that I am as my servant thinks I am. I am with him when he mentions me. If he mentions me to himself, I mention him to myself. If he mentions me in an assembly, I mention him in an assembly greater than it. And if he draws near to me a hand's length, I draw near to him an arm's length. And if he comes to me walking, I go to him running. And a similar narration that's found in the Sahih of Muslim, it simply reads that whatever my servant assumes of me, that is how I treat him. And I am with him when he remembers me. The scholars of hadith literature have explained these two narrations in this way. They've said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is relating in his own words, that whatever it is that we think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's your duty, it's my duty to think that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all powerful. That no matter what condition someone may be in at any given moment, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you believe, if you think that Allah, you think of Allah as He is. Whatever you think of Allah, if you think that the jailers are more powerful than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you think that the courts are more powerful than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that is the condition that Allah will leave us in. So Allah is telling us that He is as you think of Him. You think of Him as all-powerful, and He is. Let me share this brief story with you. I'm almost ashamed to offer up this story based on the condition that many of you are suffering with your families today. But I'll just share one thing because it's part of my personal story. One of my son-in-laws spent 19 years in state prison in North Carolina. He was in maybe 16 different prisons across the state of North Carolina for 19 years for a crime that he did not commit. He was a young man at that time, 19 years old. And he was a young man that when a newspaper copy editor was killed on her way to work, Allah would have it that this young man's name was mentioned by someone who witnessed the murder, and he called 911, and he said that his name was the best friend of my future son-in-law. And so they said, okay, well, let's look at this person whose name, this guy, this good Samaritan. Let's look at this person whose name was mentioned. And when they started looking, they said, well, maybe it wasn't him. But we know what we can do, because if his good friend is not thuggish like him, he's not a tough guy, he's not in and out of prison. So maybe what we should do is just put pressure on him and tell him, we will send you, we will execute you if you don't say that your friend killed this woman. And so, as a 19-year-old young man, he said, nope, can't do it. You have to do whatever you have to do, but I'm not saying he did it or anybody else did it. I don't know who did it, I'm not going to say. So, he was one vote away from the death penalty. One vote. He was in prison for 19 years. And because he was African American, and alhamdulillah, I gave him shahada about 9 months after he got into the prison system. And I was a part of his support committee when the defense committee was formed for him. And this process went on for 19 years. He was in prisons where guards were taking out bounties, telling racist groups in prison, we'll give you $5,000 tonight, just kill this guy. And so the Muslims in the prison had to set up a system where at night they would take turns guarding him, those who were locked up in this area, so somebody would come and stab him and kill him, because everybody knew that he's not going to make it out of this prison alive. And every place we went, it was all kinds of things. The case went through the appellate courts in North Carolina. He was turned down on every single level. Every single level. He was turned down by the United States Supreme Court. And it was after he was turned down by the U.S. Supreme Court that one of my daughters and he had been communicating. And she said that she wanted to marry him. And after he was turned down by the Supreme Court, and my wife and I were talking, you know, it doesn't look like he's going to get out. You sure you want to do this thing? And her attitude was, if I can't have him in this life, inshallah, I'll have him in the next. And so after the Supreme Court turned him down, this is when my daughter married him. If I can't have him in this world, I'll have him in the next. And so even those of us who have been supporting him for almost 20 years, to be quite honest, we were beginning to get real shaky. It doesn't look like he's going to make it out of here. It really, really doesn't. But as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I'll end on this story, But it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will to open that prison and to get him out and return him to his family and get him back on the street. It wasn't the United States Supreme Court decision. They didn't have the authority to keep him in there. Those appellate courts didn't have the authority. It was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If he is, however we believe in him. If we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can change any condition, then it will happen. If you think that we are limited by the courts, if you think we're limited by what support anybody can offer to our situation, then we are limiting ourselves. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I'm here to tell you, this is no made up story. That this is, I've had just that degree of involvement with someone who has been unfalsely locked up and looked like it was no hope. And I said that was the last thing, but this is just one final thing. I have tried to do support work for a friend of mine, Imam Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin, since he was convicted, and I, in the bottom of my heart, believe falsely convicted and given the life sentence that he was given. And his case, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, you probably know more about it than me, but his case is another one of those situations that after having gone through and walking with my daughter and my son-in-law through this episode, that I am so much more hopeful. I'm so much more hopeful about every one of your loved ones, every one of your dear ones. I'm so much more hopeful because I've seen something happen up close and personal. And so don't despair. Allah is as you think He is. There's no limitation whatsoever on the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum.
Imam Khalid, we have 10 minutes for questions. So how do you want to do this? Do you want to write down the questions, or do you want to
just call them out. Just ask.
So let's go ahead. I have a microphone. I can pass it along.
Just a follow-up with the story.
Yes.
So how the brother left prison? You didn't elaborate on that. How he was able to
Yeah, oh, good. Yeah,
be released?
Yeah, very good point.
Yeah.
We didn't break him out, I promise.
Yeah.
We didn't break him out. What actually happened was, the lawyer who was his first attorney stuck with him throughout the whole process. Even if they had gone to appellate lawyers, he stuck with him. And this lawyer said, you know what I think we need to do? Let's just do a random DNA search for everybody in prison in North Carolina.
Really?
Yeah, and all of us were saying, Mark, come on, man, you're really shooting in the dark here. I mean, this was 20 years ago, and you're talking about doing a random search of everybody, the DNA banks of what they had, of the people in prison. And sure enough, there was a hit that was so close that the court system said that this is not a match, but it's so close, it has to be his brother. There must be a twin or something, because it was just that close. And so, from this random, just almost outrageous, in football at the end and the times run out, you throw a Hail Mary pass and just hope your teammate catch it. Well, this was a Hail Mary legal pass. And so what ended up happening, they said, okay, they found the person who was locked up at that time. And they went to question him. The DA and officers went to question him. And he immediately just said, I did it. He said, I've been carrying this burden for almost 20 years. I can't take it anymore. And he confessed, and they talked to him. They said, maybe this guy's crazy. But he started providing details about the case that only the person who was there could have known. And so he confessed to it. And this was in December of 2003. And so he was released on December 24th, 2003, and on February 6th, 2004, we went back in court. He was completely exonerated.
Compensated financially?
Yes, he was.
Okay.
Yeah, he was compensated by the city and compensated by the state.
Great.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. I had a very good umrah with my family. We had a very good umrah and a trip to Egypt from part of his compensation. So he did some good things with his compensation.
Any other questions?
You know, why would the guards tell the prison people to kill certain people? Why would they need them to do that?
It was racism. It was just 100% racism. He is African American. The person who was killed was white. And many of the guards in the prison at that time, and even today, all across the country, you find these racist guards. I mean, just outrageous with their racism. And so it was a badge of honor for them if they could say, well, we were the ones who got this guy killed. And so they were willing to put up whatever amount of money and everything else. One other little quick story about that too. In one of the prisons he was in, they came up, and I had guards tell me this myself, and so I've heard it with my own ears, that there was a plan for the guard in a tower on one of the prisons where he was to shoot him if he came beyond a certain area where they weren't supposed to go. So he's standing around a wall, 25, 30 feet away from it. Somebody kicks a ball over in his direction, and it goes past the area he was supposed to go, and he's about to just step to go get the ball, and the guy runs up and tackles him. It's like, man, what's wrong with you? And he said, man, what we've heard, you're going to get your brains blown out if you go past the corner of this building. But it was just racism. That's all it was. There was no other way to put it. It was just racism.
State prison, right? State prison.
Yeah, it was in state prison. Yeah. And one of the issues that we have to be aware of as Muslims is that so many of and so we have to monitor stuff carefully. I mean, it's not just enough to advocate for release. I mean, what the process that you all are doing, this whole system is just filthy, ugly, no good. It's horrible. It's a horrible system. And so many people who have done, if you talk to Afghan soldiers who've been in Afghanistan, American troops, and who've been in Iraq, and we have, there's a guy, and I'm going to make this real short, shut up. But we have a guy, a brother, a Muslim brother, who was in the United States Marine Corps. And he was in Afghanistan and he was in Iraq. He did a lot of different tours over there. And he said that what brought him to Islam was seeing how the U.S. soldiers, what they were doing against the Afghani women in particular. He said it was like blowing his mind. And then he saw how kind the people were. The Muslims are supposed to be the devil, as they were talking about in the Marines, and they saw how kind they were. And so a lot of these guys, these whack jobs, who were doing all kinds of crazy stuff over against Muslims overseas, are now on our police forces. Now these are the same guys getting jobs in these private prisons and all these prisons all over the country. So we have to monitor what's going on and make coalitions with other groups that are monitoring and advocating on behalf of change, radical change. We got problems in this criminal justice system, prison industrial complex, that you can't put a Band-Aid on. It's beyond a Band-Aid, but Allah is in control.
So Imam Khalid, you said to the young man who asked why are they killing, you said racism, and then you said that they have to do this so they would show them that they are in control, they're taking care of the bad guys.
Yeah.
And this is exactly why our husbands and beloved ones are there.
Yeah.
The government wants to show that they are taking care of business. Of course, taking in the wrong guys, the right guys who are really criminals are out there doing what they want,
Yeah.
and the good guys are in there, locked up. just to prove a point.
And see, let me say, share one other real quick thing. See, there's so much money that's been allocated through Homeland Security that this government, starting with the FBI, have to justify their existence. And you notice, they have to justify their existence. So if they can't find something, they got to create something. And a lot of y'all's relatives have gotten caught up with these people making up stuff, creating situations so that they can justify, well, yeah, you know, right before I came downstairs today, I was flipping through, I was trying to see, and and I never watched CNN, but it was the only news thing I could find. And they had these talking heads on there, and they were talking about, see what happened up there in Canada. It shows that those Canadians don't know how to deal with terrorists. So now they are more willing to listen to us and how to deal with their problems of those Muslim terrorists, right? So now what was a very nice, almost liberal place in Canada is, Allah knows best, it may change. And so much of what the Muslims were experiencing here may start happening over there.
I have a question. We in the morning did a workshop around prison industrial complex,
Yes.
Primarily trying to understand it from an abolition, dismantling perspective.
Right.
Can you say more about the Islamic way of doing that? I think there were a lot of issues around how there are bad people and so they need to be punished. And then we have the political prisoner issues where it's unjust. And then you just said we cannot put a band-aid in it, as in we cannot do reform work because we kept expanding the prison industrial complex. So we had kind of these discussions in the morning about how to understand it from an Islamic Muslim perspective and what we as a Muslim should be doing about the prison industrial complex. That would be really helpful.
Right. You know, it's part of a global. It's part of a global economy, and the prison industrial complex is just another reflection of this oligarchy, just the businesses running the nation. They're driving everything in this country. So when Dwight Eisenhower warned against the military-industrial complex and how he was afraid that people, arms manufacturers would influence politicians to create wars just so that they could sell these weapons and this kind of thing. Well, now there's this prison industrial complex. And the commodity are not guns, but they're people. And so they're feeling, so rather than what these corporations have realized, and this is and probably more on the state level than on the federal level, but what the state prison systems have realized and they have told the businesses that it's cheaper for you to manufacture, whatever it is, women's lingerie, furniture, whatever it is you want, it's cheaper for you to manufacture it at slave wages and labor in the prisons, where you don't have to worry about unions, you don't have to worry about oversight, you don't have to worry about anybody complaining. It's cheaper to do that than to set up a manufacturing plant in Mexico or Bangladesh or China or anywhere else. So they started this process of insourcing. And so money is made, and then the hellish thing of these private prisons, which I'm sure you all have talked about. These private prisons are just a nightmare. They had two judges in western Pennsylvania who maybe a couple of years ago were busted. They were juvenile court judges. And these guys were so shameless that people, first offended young people would come in front of them. And they would just go against their own rules and sentence these young boys to these privately owned juvenile facilities, these detention centers, and send them for a long time, and they were getting money under the table. And I don't know if they sent those rascals to prison.
Yeah,
they should have gone to prison. And I hope they send them somewhere where somebody can bust their head. Somebody's, verbally, intellectually, not physically. But, they deserve anything that they get. And there's so many other things like that. So these private persons are just a way. Now, so what I would suggest, it's not an answer, it's not the Islamic solution, but in the interest of time, if everybody hasn't read, if you have an interest in this dismantling, a good start is to read this book by Angela Davis, Why Prisons Are Obsolete. It's a very good start because it starts provoking thoughts and ideas. At least it did for me when I read it a few years ago. It started provoking ideas. Because at the time I read it, I was just thinking about reform. And after I read that, I read some other stuff, and it's like, wait a minute, this is beyond Band-Aids. We got to do something else. But it's so interwoven into the whole global economy that we have to look at it on a bigger scale than just the limited way of just going after those issues. We have to do those too, but it's a much, much bigger issue. And this is why I'm saying that coalition politics is essential. I don't think as Muslims, and I don't want to say this and then remember this, but I think even the Prophet ﷺ in the early days of Medina established strategic alliances even with the mushrik. They were not strong enough at a certain point to defend and protect and do other things, so they established these strategic alliances, and I think that's what we have to do.
Imam Khalid, a question that was reiterated today during one of our sessions, and one sister kept saying, where are our Muslim leaders? Where are our Muslim leaders from this? What are they doing? They are not strategizing together. Maybe one city has a great community, great leaders who speak on behalf of the oppressed. Most of the other places are not. And she gave an example that when Obama had the iftar, when Obama had the iftar in Ramadan, he invited the Israeli ambassador while Gaza was being bombarded, and she said they should have left. They shouldn't have stayed, but they chose to sit and eat and enjoy. And so where are our leaders from this? What do you say? You're one of our leaders here. Maybe you have an answer.
That's an excellent point. There's to show how another example of how wrong this is for any of us to know what's going on and not do anything about it. There is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ has made it clear that if you are present and something is being done that's against what Allah would have us do, if you're present, you can be standing right there looking at it. But if you are in disagreement with it, it's as if you weren't there. So Allah is not going to hold you accountable for it, even if you were there. If you couldn't stop it, if you're against it, then Allah is not going to hold you responsible. But if you are so far away from it, you would need, a telescope to see what's going on. But you agree with it, or you're silent in the face of it, then it's just like you're the one who's committing the act. And so it's to me, it's shameful. It's shameful, the position that so many of us have taken as it relates to speaking out against oppression and speaking up and advocating on behalf of the oppressed. There's no excuse. And I don't want to venture to say why this position is taken by so many of our leaders. But I will say that there are some, and probably none that you know, but there are some who are afraid. Astaghfirullah, forgive me for just throwing it out in a blanket kind of way, but I'm not going to call any names. But I've had conversations, and so I'll just say on my limited experience with some of the conversations that I've had, there was no other point for me to arrive at other than he's afraid of what may happen if he takes a position or a stand. And so, so I know that there are those who are afraid. Inshallah, it's not everybody. I would hope that a lot of it is that they may not know. I mean, somehow they've been under a rock, and they just haven't come out from under the rock long enough to know. But it's unfortunate. It's really unfortunate. Like the issue that Mari has championed for so many years. He's championed so many issues. A lot of what I notice going on, I can read his newsletter and pick up on something and say, oh yeah, I need to get involved with that. Or something like that. Oh yeah, I need to go over here and do this and do that. But the issue of Afia Siddiqui. And Mari and I have had long conversations about, I mean, what is the deal with this? And so, as the months and years have gone by, I've started to ask responsible Muslims, what is the deal? Tell me, what is the issue? Why won't this group say something? Why don't you say something? What's the issue? And wallahi adeem, I've been told that I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying.
They're scared.
They're scared.
That's what it was about.
It's nothing short of that. They are afraid. And may Allah give us courage. We should pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala take the fear out of our hearts.
Jazakallah khair, barakallah feek. You know, we can go on and on, I think, with this discussion, and we will not probably reach a decision.